Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In today's webinar, Phillip Campbell will introduce us to the Dark Ages. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Parish and Curriculum Marketing Specialist at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions may be sent to our presenter using this box here that you see on the GoToWebinar panel, and I will read as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you tomorrow via email. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Phillip Campbell is an author of several books, including Story of the Church and the 4-volume Story of Civilization series. He has also contributed to and edited a number of books and wrote 2 history textbooks. He is an instructor at Homeschool Connections. Campbell has a bachelor's degree in European history from Ave Maria University and a certificate in secondary education from Madonna University. Campbell has appeared on EWTN Television, Ave Maria Radio, Radio Maria, Good Shepherd Catholic Radio, Modern Day Radio, and on the Crawford Broadcasting Network. Phillip, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. I'm very happy to be here to talk about the Dark Ages, or the not so dark ages.
That's great. Yes, we look forward to hearing more about that. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
Okay.
Okay, and with
All right.
that,
How's that?
That looks great. Yep, we can see it. You can take it away.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to my webinar. And as you may know, this is part of a promotion for my new book, The Church and the Dark Ages, St. Benedict Charlemagne and the Rise of Christendom, covering the years 430 to 1027. Very specific year, 1027. Didn't go to 1000, didn't go to 1050, 1027 specifically. But there's a reason for that. But at any rate, this is part of a great series from Ave Maria Press, and now Aaron's going to talk more about the series at the end of the webinar. So this presentation today is called Light in the Darkness, Teaching the Dark Ages. And I guess the question we need to answer when we deal with the Dark Ages is, I'll talk about the name Dark Ages and why they're called that, and in what sense are they dark, and what sense is that, a misnomer. What I want to do today is kind of just highlight some points about this period in history relating to the Catholic Church's place in this time in history, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. This is not going to be a history lesson on the Dark Ages. That's too big for something like this. I teach a book section they say on this period of history that goes 12 weeks, and it goes from I think 3.5 years, 7 so we can get through the whole. So at any rate, let's start here. What are the ages? The Dark Ages? When are the Dark Ages? For some people, the Dark Ages to be the entirety of the Christian era. Yeah.
Phillip, it seems like the reception is not real good. I wonder if you turned off your camera, if it would be stronger so we could hear you. Looks like you're frozen. Here we go. Were you able to hear me?
Just now is the first thing I can hear.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder if you turn off your camera, if we might be able to get better reception.
Okay, hold on one second.
Okay.
Let me make sure I'm on the right Wi-Fi too.
Okay, sure.
And I'm not. Okay, well, that's
okay. Maybe that's the problem.
Sorry, guys, I live in the middle of nowhere.
Okay, so I think we started to lose you when you said this won't be a history lesson. You can maybe
Okay,
go from there.
can you hear me okay right now?
We can, yes.
Okay, I'm gonna try keeping up like this. If there's another problem, then we'll shut the camera off.
Okay.
All right. Okay. What I was saying before I got lost is this isn't going to be a comprehensive history lesson on the Dark Ages because it's just too much information. I teach a class for Homeschool Connections on the Dark Ages, and it takes a whole semester. We take 12 weeks in this period to go through it, and we don't even get through all of it. We only go to the year 732. So I'm going to mainly highlight some things about the church's role in the Dark Ages, socially, politically, and kind of address some different things people tend to bring up when they speak about the Dark Ages. So first off, when were the Dark Ages? That depends on who you ask. If you talk to people who are like vehemently anti-Christian, they pretty much consider the Dark Ages to be everything before the modern time. So for some people, the Dark Ages are just the entire Christian era, like from the end of the Roman Empire up to 1789 with the French Revolution. And they see that the Dark Ages basically went until the Enlightenment, which is a crazy broad view of the Dark Ages and very, very kind of presentist and arrogant, if you ask me, to assume that everything before the founding of our own modern epoch was the Dark Ages. So that's what you get if you talk to some people about it. For others, it's more synonymous with the medieval period, like from 476 to 1517. This is a view that you will get if you talk to like devoted evangelical Protestants. Basically, the Dark Ages go until Martin Luther brings us out of them with the Reformation. So these are two common views of what the Dark Ages are. But from the historian's point of view, historians apply the term Dark Ages to just a very small period of time, the early Middle Ages, usually from the fall of Rome to sometime around the turn of the first millennium, roughly a period of about 500 years. So that's what my book covers, is around the year 430 to 1027. It's just the first, kind of like the first half of the Middle Ages is what historians think of as the Dark Ages. Okay, so we're looking at history as it was unfolding in the West, 5th century, 6th century, 7th century, and so on. So like the Crusades are not in the Dark Ages, the Black Death is not in the Dark Ages, stuff like that isn't in the Dark Ages. We're talking about much earlier, early Middle Ages. Now, the challenge of dealing with the Dark Ages as a Catholic is that rightly or wrongly, people associate the Dark Ages with the era when the Catholic Church enjoyed social dominance. Obviously, we know that later in church history, the church's role will get challenged. We'll have schisms with the Orthodox, and then the Protestant Reformation. Things get fragmented. But earlier than that, in the first half of the Middle Ages, the church was unified, and it enjoyed a unique social dominance. And so, rightly or wrongly, people associate the Dark Ages with that period, and they think, oh yeah, well, if and it becomes almost an anti-Catholic club, like kind of like, oh yeah, if the Catholic Church, if the Catholic Church had its way today, we'd go back to the Dark Ages. Like this would be our society if we adopted Catholic values. The implicit argument is like, hey, we tried Catholicism once, and this is what we got, was the Dark Ages. So I'm not going back to that. This, by the way, is just simply a picture that comes up when I Google the Dark Ages. That's why I include this in here. You just Google the Dark Ages, you get this picture of this murky looking town with a person randomly hanging from a building. Very goofy stuff here. Anyone who knows history knows that the architecture of this city looks more like it's in the 1400s, not in the Dark Ages. It's even like literally raining. Like if Catholicism comes back, it'll literally get dark and leaves will fall off the trees. But so this is the kind of I guess residual prejudice about this period that we have to deal with as Catholics because of the association of the Dark Ages with Catholic Christendom. So the implication is that this is the kind of society that Catholic Christianity delivers. So where do these prejudices about the Dark Ages come from? Because most people who believe this know very little about the actual Dark Ages themselves. So this comes partially from our heritage of anti-Catholic propaganda that we inherited from Britain and the Enlightenment. Let's not forget that the United States was we were British colonies. Britain, England was one of the most, and if not the most anti-Catholic country in Europe. And so we, as a country that has roots in British colonialism, we kind of culturally have assimilated a lot of the anti-Catholic propaganda we inherited from Britain and from the Enlightenment period in particular. Also, contemporary anti-Christian prejudice, modern anti-Christian prejudice that sees any sort of, I guess, any sort of moral values or place for the Christian faith in the public sphere as a kind of reversion back to medievalism. So there's modern anti-Christian prejudice, and then there's just general ignorance of history, just general ignorance of history. For example, many people would be surprised if I told them that heretics weren't burned in the Dark Ages. They'd be like, "What? Yes, they were." Like, people just assume things about the era that they don't know. One time when I was student teaching years ago, getting my education degree, I was sitting in on a class. I was shadowing a teacher in the public schools who was teaching on this period, and he was saying all sorts of just nonsense stuff, like people didn't take baths, and like it's all this horrible stuff, just stuff that's like repeated about the Middle Ages, but just that is utter nonsense. So there's kind of like a threefold prejudice that leads people to think of this era very negatively. So what people think made the Dark Ages dark? So if you ask people what's so bad about the Dark Ages, they will say things like, well, it's the triumph of superstition over science, religious tyranny and violence, widespread ignorance, like the church intentionally keeping people from reading or learning or questioning, like as if people would ask questions about science and the church would say, like, shut up, we don't allow thinking, or something like that. Very common assumption. People think of things like Inquisition and torture, witch burnings, trial by ordeal, anti-rationalism, the oppression of women, and slavery. So this is just kind of like the mental soup that people that comes into people's heads when they think of the period known as the Dark Ages, and this is why they were dark in their mind. Now you see, all these things have to do with the church or are related to the church. It's the church that pushes superstition and religious tyranny, the church that's keeping people from reading, the church that is torturing people and having the Inquisition, that's burning witches, that is oppressing women and enslaving people. So this is what a lot of people assume the Dark Ages is about. Okay, but now what really made the era the Dark Ages? Like, what was really going on? Because the Dark Ages, I don't want to be untruthful and say they were like the best time ever. They weren't. I think the Dark Ages were a pretty rough time, but they weren't rough for these reasons, and that's the point. They were rough for other reasons. So let's look at the name Dark Ages. Why was it called the Dark Ages? The phrase Dark Ages originally referred not to the standard of living, not to the quality of life. Like the phrase did not mean the era is dark because life was miserable. It simply referred to the scarcity of historical documents about the era. And ironically, this phrase Dark Ages was coined by a Catholic historian, Cardinal Baronius, who coined the term in 1588. He wrote this compendium of church history called Annales Ecclesiastici. Let me try that again. Annales Ecclesiastici. It's like the annals of the church. And so it was this like encyclopedic history of the Catholic Church, written during the time of the Protestant Reformation. And when Baronius got up to like the 900s and the early 1000s, he lamented that he couldn't find a lot of historical sources on the events of the 900s. because the 900s were so chaotic all over Europe that that there wasn't as much documented as in other historical periods. And he referred to this time period as a saeculum obscurum, which means a dark age. And he simply meant it dark age in the sense of like, it's dark from the point of view of the historical record. The sources drop off. There's not a lot of writings. He couldn't find the documentation he needed for his book to explain what was going on in that period. So that's what Dark Age referred to. Now, this term was later extended to the entire chaotic period from the fall of Rome to around the year 1050. So that is the origin of the phrase Dark Age. And once you realize that it's a literary reference and not like a moral or social condemnation of life in the period, it's kind of like, okay, we need to rethink what our historiographical assumptions about this period in time are. But as I said, it was a rough period. What made it so chaotic? If it wasn't witch burnings and anti-rationalism and oppression of women and all these things, what really did make this period so chaotic? Well, several things. Number one, the political collapse of the Roman Empire. That was a big deal. The Roman Empire kept order in Europe. By the time it collapsed for 6 or 7 centuries, depending on what area you were in. I mean, imagine the chaos that would ensue here if the United States entirely collapsed. It would be, we definitely have a step down from the quality of life our parents enjoyed. That's what happens when huge empires break up, when there's a total political and societal collapse. That's the major factor. But also mass demographic changes brought about by Germanic migrations. So you not only have the political structure completely collapse, but then you have hundreds of thousands of outsiders migrating in to previous Roman territories with new languages, new customs, new lifestyles, mingling with, sometimes mingling with the Romans, sometimes fighting with them, establishing their own kingdoms, fighting with each other. So it's kind of like a mass demographic invasion on top of political collapse. The decline of the cities. At the end of the Roman era, cities just went into decline. Rome shrunk significantly in the 5th and 6th centuries compared to its size at the height of the Roman Empire, and life became simply more rural. And large cities, due to the collapse of infrastructure, economic problems, warfare, city life became not so desirable. And so life became more rural. And anytime life becomes more rural, it becomes more simple, right? So that was a huge factor, was the decline of the cities. Also, you have the infusion of all these new language groups, which made ancient literature unreadable, except to an educated elite. The Romans and the Greeks bequeathed unto Europe a vast trove of a rich literary heritage. And as long as you knew Latin and Greek, you could read this. But with all the Germanic barbarians coming in with the demographic changes, and now they're speaking Frankish and North Germanic and Visigothic and Saxon and all these other languages, Burgundian. All of a sudden, the ancient literature is unreadable now to all these people, except to an educated elite. And even those who are not part of the invaders, not part of the Germanic invasions, over time, they're still adopting to the new languaes. Over time, the Latin-speaking population of Spain, they don't speak Latin anymore. They speak vulgar Latin, and then they speak like Visigoth, and then it turns into Spanish. Same thing in England. It goes from old Brythonic to old Anglo-Saxon, which is Old English, and then Middle English. So the language groups change, and all of a sudden, a lot of what was produced in antiquity is unreadable. So it's like the vast knowledge that had been passed on just became inaccessible to most of society in the West. Imagine what a terrible effect that would have on our society if through some fluke, like, snap of a finger, imagine like Thanos snaps his glove or something, and all of a sudden all the information on the internet, it becomes garbled into some unreadable script, and all the information everywhere in every book, all the road signs, it just becomes garbled, and only 2% of the population can read it. Like, imagine how that would set us back. Well, that's comparable to what happened at the end of the Dark Age, or at the end of the Roman Empire, although not instantly, but over a gradual period of many decades. So that made things, that set people back considerably. You get the replacement of Roman law with barbarian law. So Rome had a very sophisticated, worked out system of jurisprudence that it had developed over several centuries. And then with the invasion of the barbarians, that just kind of gradually falls by the wayside for barbarian law, which is going to be less refined than Roman law, right? Barbarian law is a lot simpler. It's a lot like, oh, you killed my brother, we're going to have a blood feud, or else you have to pay me some money to pay me off. It's like there's no more court system. There's no more going before a magistrate to plead your case. There's no more lawyers. There's just very simple barbarian law, and that too makes society much more rough, because I think the refinement of a society is reflected in the in its legal system. So barbarian law replaces Roman law. Constant invasions too. There's the funny thing is the barbarian invasion. It's not like the barbarians invade and then they settle down and the invasions just end. It's like you have the first group of barbarians that comes in, like the Germanic barbarians, your Visigoths, your Ostrogoths, your Franks, and they settle down, and then it's like there's invasion 2.0 that comes afterwards. That's when you get your Huns and your Arabs and your Vikings and all the second wave barbarians that start invading and wreaking havoc on Europe. What a lot of people don't realize is that for the first like 600 years, 700 years of Christian Europe was constantly under attack from the outside. People think of Europe as like an imperial power. Europe is whether the Crusades or the Age of Exploration or the colonial, Europe conquering things. But for the first 600-700 years after the fall of Rome, Europe was constantly on the defensive, constantly being invaded. Its very existence was always on the brink, always uncertain. Europe almost became Muslim between 717 and 732, when the Muslims tried to conquer Constantinople and invaded Spain and France within a few years of each other. The Vikings almost completely destabilized European society. I mean, they did destabilize it considerably. It could have been very worse if they hadn't been Christianized. So Europe was constantly being invaded. It was like a big battleground. You have a dropping off in trade. In the Roman period and the Greek period, there was a lot of international trade. Society was very mercantile. There was a wealthy class of merchants in ancient Rome called equites, like capitalist, entrepreneurial class of people. But with the breakdown of all this other stuff, one thing we know is that business does not go on as usual if society is breaking down. And so you shift away from a mercantile society to just kind of like subsistence agriculture, people staying in their own areas farming just to feed themselves rather than trading. I mean, obviously trade still continued. It didn't drop down to zero, but compared to where it was in the Roman period, it dropped considerably. And obviously with the breakdown of trade and switch to subsistence agriculture, that also has a deleterious effect on quality of life. Also, the breakdown of Latin into provincial languages, making cross-cultural communication different. We talked about how the ancient literature became inaccessible, but also with the rise of all these provincial languages, just cross-cultural communication with people in different parts of Europe became difficult. So it wasn't like it was anymore, where in ancient Greece, where a mathematician in Alexandria could write a treatise on some experiments he was doing, and everybody in the Greek world, whether they were in Greece or Antioch or Sicily, could read the treatise and have something like a scientific community. It was a lot more difficult for people to communicate with each other due to the breakdown of Latin into provincial languages. I think that's the last one here. Yeah, so So this is what really made the era chaotic, right? It was like a total societal collapse, a total reversion from a highly organized, urban, refined society under Rome down to uh, something that was more agricultural, more subsistence, more basic in terms of the quality of life. So this is really why the era was chaotic. Now, for the Catholic historian, the task is to determine what role the church played in all this chaos. In what sense did the church preserve civilization despite the darkness? And so again, I don't want to deny that the era was dark in that sense. All that stuff I just mentioned, that's very chaotic, you know. So in what sense did the church preserve that flame of civilization and culture in the midst of all this? In what sense did the church contribute to the darkness? Did the church contribute to any of the chaos? That's the question we have to ask as well. Or maybe also, in what sense did the church facilitate neither preservation nor decline, but simply transformation, simply transforming society, not merely preserving the ancient culture, not contributing to the darkness, but just facilitating a transformation of Europe from one thing into something else. Now, we should also avoid a polemical approach to the question. We are not out to prove things, just to find truth. I think this is important as a Catholic historian, you know, that we're not out to prove things. Obviously, I think the church has been maligned for its role in the Dark Ages. I think the church's true role in this period is much more positive, but that doesn't mean I'm interested in papering over problematic aspects of church history, or denying that there were issues occasionally, as there are today, right? So we want to just try and be just try and find out what really happened. That's the best thing we can do. So let's start out by noting that the church had extreme moral influence at this time. It was the moral influence in the early medieval world, and it was a very newly dominant religious institution. Newly dominant, like it still had that zeal, that invigoration of being new. So, for example, the very first ecumenical council of Nicaea had only occurred 85 years before the sack of Rome in 410, which many people say is like the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. So the church was just a few centuries old when it started enjoying this position of kind of unparalleled moral dominance. It was the most authoritative, fastest growing, zealous institution in the Roman Empire. And what this means is that people had to take the view of the church seriously, even if they were not Christians, even if in the early Middle Ages they're still pagans. You could not afford to just ignore what the church thought about things. So whether you were a Christian or an opponent of the church, you had to deal with the influence of the church. And this means that the church was going to set the tone for the moral compass of society as it emerged in the post-Roman era. And that was going to be true whether you liked the church or not. The church simply set the tone for the people. It was very active. It was the active agent, the leaven in society, that was leavening society with the principles of the Christian faith. It also had unparalleled intellectual authority in this period for several reasons. With the decline of the Roman civil service, clergy were the only educated literate class left. So if you lived in, let's say, the 1st century BC, like the time of Julius Caesar, and you were a person of extreme intellectual prowess, charisma, a skilled speaker, you would probably go into government. You would go into civil service in the government of Rome, because that was the best outlet for your gifts and talents. But with the disappearance of Rome, if you were that person and you were born in the year 500 or 600, intellectually astute, charismatic, demonstrating great promise, you would go into the church, because that was really the only place that was the only educated literate class that was left in society at the time. So it attracted the best and the brightest minds. And so this gave the church a great intellectual authority. The new barbarian lords of Europe were not educated and seldom literate. Most kings of the period could not write their name. Even going much later into the period, I mean, even in the time of Charlemagne, who was, he ruled in the early 9th century, Charlemagne could not write. And he had an amusing excuse for it. He said that he'd spent so many years holding his sword that his fingers were permanently warped from holding his sword in battle, and he couldn't hold a pen or a quill. And that was his, he was like, "It's not my fault. I just spent so much years swinging my sword." So by the time of Charlemagne, I mean, he knew it was a valuable thing to write, but he couldn't do it. So most barbarian lords and even kings couldn't write, could barely write. Charlemagne signed his name with a symbol. He had this cool symbol that he signed his name with. For several centuries, the church had a monopoly on education in Western Europe. The most highly educated individuals were all churchmen. We'll talk about education briefly here, but so in this period, education was a clerical, it was a clerical thing, and it will be a clerical thing for most of the Middle Ages. So for these reasons, the church enjoyed like absolute intellectual dominance of the period. And that makes it a very formative force when you have when you are the moral force, the intellectual force, that gives it an extreme amount of influence in society. And it enjoyed political influence. So the influence of the church on the Dark Ages, there we go. The influence of the church in the Dark Ages was very much related to the collapse of all the other social and governing institutions. So the Roman Empire in the West falls between 410 and 476. And with the fall of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church is really like the only influential organization left that had the power to provide social cohesion, right? So it was the empire that used to provide social cohesion. How do you keep all these different the peoples and languages and cultures united? Well, the Roman Empire used to provide that unity by its political and military force. But with the collapse of Rome, the church is really the only transnational institution left, right? It is the only influential organization that can provide any sort of social unity. And in many areas, bishops took over the functions that had previously been civil. Now, this was true of the bishops of Rome, especially after the imperial power vacated Italy. So they exercised broad political authority over vast tracts of land in Italy and Sicily, which was called the patrimony of St. Peter. These were like these vast tracts of land that the church had picked up over time, either from having it donated to them or just from the dissolution of other political authority. The church kind of oversaw the governance of these lands. The patrimony of St. Peter will only get enlarged throughout the Dark Ages and eventually become the Papal States, the independent kingdom in Italy, ruled by the church. So you will see bishops taking on, especially in the urbanized areas of the former Roman Empire, you'll see them taking on a kind of political role. Like if you read the letters of Gregory the Great, he's very interested in the administrative aspects of the patrimony of St. Peter. You see him writing to his agents in Sicily and southern Italy, talking about defenses for the cities or collecting the grain, getting the grain shipped out, tax administration, stuff like that. Functions that in a normal society the government would have carried out had there been a powerful central government. Okay, so basically I've kind of positioned the church here as in a spot of social influence, politically, intellectually, morally. And what we've seen, I think, is that the church did not cause the social and political collapse of the Dark Ages, but it was the most influential institution going into them. So the church didn't cause any of that stuff that we went over before about the dissolution of society, but moving into that period, it definitely was the most influential institution. So the question then is, how did the church utilize its influence during these centuries? Now, if I was teaching a history class on the Dark Ages, in a Catholic school, if I was talking about this in RCIA, and when I was in RCIA, I used to teach RCIA, I did a few lessons on Catholic Church history to deal with some of the stuff. So if I was teaching the history of the Dark Ages, the following slides are what I would kind of emphasize as the church's place in this period. The church was a great preserver of literature, for one thing. The Benedictine order, which was founded in the 500s, viewed writing as part of the labor of monastic life. And the monks copied not only the scriptures and religious works, but any writings of antiquity they could get their hands on. It's estimated that over 90% of ancient writings that we know of today have survived because the monks copied them during the Dark Ages. I would absolutely stress this point, that our knowledge of the ancient world at all, like the fact that we know about Homer or Julius Caesar or Socrates, like a lot of this stuff has to do with the fact that monks copied it down, either Greek monks or Western monks, but it's because monks were intentionally preserving literature as part of their monastic vocation. So this was definitely a positive impact on the period and on our own knowledge of history. The church also vastly improved the lands of Western Europe, and this especially through the monks. Now I know these are Cistercians. There wasn't Cistercians in the Dark Ages, but I couldn't find a good picture from the era. So literally improving the physical landscape of Europe. Vast tracts of European wilderness were made habitable or improved by monastic activities. For example, monks would drain wetlands. They would breed improved livestock. Monks were excellent breeders of livestock and other animals. Breeding stronger strands of wheat, because the Benedictine rules emphasis on manual labor and farming. Monks over the ages experimented with breeding better grains of wheat, and they with the result that the wheat that was being farmed by the end of the Dark Ages was vastly superior to what was being farmed earlier in Roman times. Putting land under cultivation, that is just taking fallow land that had always been wilderness and turning into agricultural land that could support a population. Clearing forests, and even creating distinctive regional identities by the creation of different drinks, cheeses, etc., that are part of cultural identity of many European regions. And I might say, like, oh, what's the big deal? The monks created some cheese. Like, a lot of the regional identities in Europe are bound up with these sort of regional specialties. You know, like we've all heard it, like, it's not champagne unless it comes from the Champagne region of France. You know, like that's their distinctive regional regional sparkling wine. Or Parmesan cheese was invented by monks in Italy. So they created regional identity, these kind of regional foods and beverages and things like that that gave rise to various that people associate with regional identities. Part of the reason the monks were so good at all this is because they intentionally sought out of the way places. Your average monk, he's looking for somewhere to get away. So Benedict, he goes to the mountain of Subiaco, which was this wild mountain that was all overgrown with thorns, or Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, when he founds Clairvaux Monastery, it's like in this marshy, valley that nobody lives in. So they're intentionally seeking out these out of the way places that are wilderness, and then over time they improve them and make them habitable. So the physical landscape of Europe was transformed by the presence of these monks into something more habitable, including the founding of cities. Wherever the church went, it founded abbeys. This is true in Germany, in Ireland, wherever there was like a very large missionary effort. Now, because the abbeys were centers of education and influence, people wanted to be close to them. So scores of Europe's most eminent cities began as abbeys. Churches and abbeys were at the heart of Europe's transformation from a rural continent to an urban one throughout the Middle Ages. So you see here medieval Dublin with the monastery at its heart, surrounded by the town. This was a layout you would see in many cities, where you'd have a monastery at the heart of it, and then the city kind of grows up around it. So, and there's just tons of them. There's a great example is Fulda in Germany, which was the diocese founded by Saint Boniface of famous tree chopping fame. He founded the abbey of Fulda Abbey, and then a city grows up around it, and he becomes the bishop. And then before you know it, Fulda is like this thriving cultural center, and that's going to be the case with many cities throughout Europe. Let's not forget the pacification of barbarian tribes. I mentioned that barbarians continued to invade Europe throughout the Dark Ages. Here you see a picture of Vikings doing what Vikings do best, plunder. So this was what Europeans in the Dark Ages had to deal with occasionally, especially if you were a monk. You had to always wonder, like, is this about to happen to me? Are the Vikings about to show up and pillage my monastery? But wherever the church's missionaries spread, they facilitated the slow work of pacifying the rugged and often violent barbarian tribes who lived on Europe's frontiers. And there was lots of them: Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Vikings, Slavs, the Rus, all these different tribes that originally had a hostility to the Catholic faith. But over time, they're transformed from violent raiders living by plunder into settled communities living agricultural lifestyles, because even though they occasionally attacked churches, as you see here, that didn't stop the church from sending missionaries to these people, because the church believed in their, desired their salvation, but also knew that the best way to live in peace was to bring the gospel to these people and to convert them. And so eventually, as these groups became Christianized, they settled down and they became civilized. And this was due to the effects of the gospel and the church's condemnation of living by plunder. So yeah, once the Vikings convert, the message is like, okay, you can't slaughter and pillage anymore. Not even a little bit of pillage? No, not even a little bit of pillage. You have to make an honest living. So over time, from the preaching of the church, these groups, they transform from like these nomadic plundering cultures into more conventional civilizations. Like the very word Viking itself, it means something similar to like pirate or raider, because that was so integral to their identity. But then gradually, as they embrace the Christian faith in the 900s and 1000s, they are going to settle down into the kingdoms of Norway and Sweden and Denmark, etc. So I guess we don't want to gloss over the effects that just the simple conversion of these people had on society, because it did definitely transform them from cultures that lived by plunder and by kind of like nomadic plunder into settled sedentary cultures. The church also contributed to the diminution of slavery. Now, the economy of the pre-Christian world had been built entirely on slavery. Roman economy was built on slavery, big time. The church repeatedly legislated against the keeping of Christian slaves as not fitting their dignity as children of God. So the church was very vehement that Christians could not be enslaved, and as more people converted to Christianity, that meant there was just less people who were liable to be subject to slavery. Couple this with the fact that the new Germanic kingdoms that were supported by the church tended to favor monetary fines for crimes instead of slavery, whereas in more ancient law codes, slavery is a common sort of punishment for crime or for debt or things like that. The new Germanic kingdoms tended to favor monetary fines if you committed a crime instead of slavery. So as Christianity spread, slavery was gradually eliminated and replaced by serfdom. Now, serfdom is still considered an inferior social status that has limited freedoms because a serf is tied to the land. But nevertheless, serfs were not owned by anyone. and as such, they were free in a way their slave ancestors in Rome would have never been. So gradually, the slaves disappear, they turn into serfs, and gradually those serfs are going to turn into free peasants, kind of like a burgeoning peasant middle class towards the end of the Middle Ages. And I think the Christianization of Europe is very directly related to this due to the church's insistence that you cannot keep fellow Christians as slaves, as it is not fitting their dignity as children of God. Now, some people claim that the church abolished slavery. This is not true. The church abolished the slavery of Christians. There was no condemnation of slavery in principle until much later, till like the 16th century. So, for example, the slavery of Muslims was practiced in coastal communities of the Mediterranean throughout the Middle Ages, but in a very limited way, very small way. Because what we see here is that that's why I wrote the church is responsible for the diminution of slavery. The church did not say slavery is bad because it's contrary to human dignity. They said slavery, you cannot enslave Christians because it's not fitting with their dignity as people who've been set free by Jesus Christ. So it wasn't objecting to the principle of slavery, but to who was being enslaved, namely Christians. So it would be much later until the period of the Age of Exploration, African slavery, etc., before slavery as such started getting condemned. But nevertheless, slavery virtually vanished throughout the Middle Ages, especially compared to its scale under the Roman Empire, where the entire economy was focused on slavery. Another great point to bring up is the freedom of marriage. So in the ancient world, women had little legal options in the choice of a spouse. In most cases, they were legally bound to marry whomever their father wished them to. The father could literally say, I'm giving you to this man and you have to marry him, and that was the law. That was pretty universal in the ancient world. I'm sure there were exceptions, but I mean, that's why we speak of being given in marriage, because the father literally gives the woman to someone. Now, the Christian sacrament of matrimony, however, stressed that the consent of both parties was necessary for the sacrament. This is just part of our sacramental theology, and there's actually a chapter in the book on sacramental development through the Dark Ages. Part of the form of the sacrament of matrimony is that you have to have the consent of both parties. Now, this emphasis on consent empowered the woman to have the final say in whom she would marry, and that was something very new. Of course, you're still going to have custom, social pressure, and familial influence are all still going to favor marriages that are arranged. You're still going to have arranged marriages throughout the Middle Ages. You're still going to have that social and familial pressure for the woman to marry who the dad wants her to marry. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, she could not be legally compelled to marry against her express wishes. And you see all sorts of examples of this during the age of the martyrs in the very end of the Roman Empire, where there's fathers who want their daughters to marry and the daughters refuse, and they're martyred because under Roman law, you know, the father had that right. But going into the Dark Ages now, in the Middle Ages, the woman has the ultimate, she has a veto power. She can't be legally compelled to marry against her express wishes. All she has to do is go to the altar and say, no, I do not wish to marry this guy, and she cannot be forced to. So this is probably the single biggest leap forward for women's rights in the history of the human race, given that it was virtually unknown before Christendom, thousands of years of human civilization, and this is a real leap forward in that sense. Another big benefit to women was the ending of polygamy. Now, the church was relentless in preaching against polygamy, which was widely practiced by the Germanic tribes. By the 8th century, the practice had largely disappeared, due to the church's insistence that lawful intercourse could only occur within the context of marriage. And so this started to stigmatize other kinds of sexually exploitive activities. Now, of course, I'm not saying like the church ended rape and prostitution. Certainly not. You're still going to have rape and prostitution, all those things that go on throughout the era. But the big difference is that it became acknowledged that these things were sinful and that virtuous persons ought not to engage in, which was better than before, when they were simply accepted as part of life, when it was simply accepted that, like, oh yes, of course, if I'm pillaging a city, rape is something that I have the right to do, you know, or something like that. I mean, I'm not saying those things stopped happening, but the difference was that they were understood and acknowledged to be sinful and looked down upon, rather than simply being accepted. Also, during the Dark Ages, education was exclusively in the hands of the church. Schools were attached to monasteries who taught students reading, music, astronomy, and arithmetic. And the poor and children of nobility alike could be educated at these schools. In fact, during the reign of Charlemagne, it was decreed that schools under monastic supervision be established throughout Western Europe, offering free education to anyone who wished. Now, before the church came along, no institution had made a comprehensive effort to educate commoners like this. It wasn't ultimately successful because most common poor people didn't have the freedom of time to just go to school all the time. But the point is that the church and the culture the church inspired saw a value in educating, educating everybody. So this was a big benefit as well. So I think these are all ways that we see that the church had what I would say is a positive societal impact during the Dark Ages, especially this too, experimental science. Now, science was admittedly more stagnant in the Dark Ages compared to like in ancient Greece, but the church did not suppress scientific inquiry. In fact, most theoretical advances in science during this period were made by monks and clergymen who were dabbling in scientific inquiry. Scientific treatises were very popular reading during this period, and medieval people were constantly experimenting. Like, people loved reading scientific treatises, and eminent churchmen wrote scientific treatises, like St. Bede the Venerable wrote scientific treatises. Isidore of Seville wrote them. Later in the Middle Ages, Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, he wrote scientific treatises. Robert Grosseteste wrote a manual on optics. They were super curious. They were constantly experimenting and came up with a lot of advancements in science that even surpassed what the Romans had. I have a class at Homeschool Connections called Invention, Technology, and Medicine in the Middle Ages that goes through a lot of this. It's for middle schoolers, in case you're interested. All right, so what about some of these other things, like heresy trials? I mentioned at the beginning, we think of the Middle Ages like, oh, burning heretics. Heresy was not actually punished with civil penalties during the Dark Ages, which might be surprising to you. It was not until much later, around the 13th century, that the death penalty for heresy was introduced broadly. The Inquisition did not exist in the Dark Ages, so this was something that came along much later, in the later Middle Ages, not in the Dark Ages. But even then, even when we get to the period when the death penalty for heresy was introduced, it was not imposed by the church. What a lot of people don't understand is that heresy was a civil crime. It was a civil crime established in statute by various kings of Christendom. So the first king to institute a law for the death penalty for heresy was Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, right? It was a civil penalty. So the church didn't execute heretics, the civil government did, not the church. It was the government that put heretics to death. The church did have a role in this, obviously, because the church's role was to determine if a person was guilty of heresy. If a person was guilty of heresy and was unrepentant, they could be handed over to the civil authorities. But in the Dark Ages, if you were a heretic, you were simply expelled from the diocese. So you get caught preaching heresy in the year 700 somewhere in England or wherever, the bishop just runs you out of the diocese. That's about it. So there wasn't the death penalty for heresy in the Dark Ages. Also, you might have heard of trial by ordeal. This is what kind of replaced Roman law in the Dark Ages. Here you see a man sticking his hand in a cauldron of boiling water to prove his innocence. Trial by ordeal was a concept that was brought by the Germanic tribes, and it was practiced in Germanic countries. This was not originally a Christian idea. This was something that came from the pagan Germans. However, it became very widespread because of the diffusion of Germanic culture. And at first, the church did participate in trials by ordeal. And I was surprised a few years ago to find the church even had liturgical rites or blessings for the occasion. Like before the man came to stick his hand in the boiling water, the priest had like a rite, like, oh God, may you, if this man is innocent, blah, blah, blah. They had an actual liturgical rite for a trial by ordeal. But by the latter Dark Ages, the church began to push for outlawing the custom. I think the more refined and educated churchmen always realized that this was not a valid way of proceeding with legal inquiry. So the church began to push for application of law, like juridical procedure to determine guilt or innocence, such that largely by the church's efforts, trial by ordeal and trial by combat disappeared from Europe, largely because of the church's intercession. And finally, what about the accusation that religion is spread by the sword in the Dark Ages? This is just very false. Religion was not spread by the sword in the Dark Ages, at least in the sense we think of like Islam or something. Missionary activity was carried out by missionary monks and bishops like St. Columba, who you see at left here, St. Boniface of Germany, St. Augustine of Kent. Missionary monks who came to pagan lands to preach the gospel without force of arms, only with the force of their personalities, their eloquence and the grace of God that aided them. So religion was not spread by the sword. Even the Crusades were not about spreading religion by the sword. That's just a ridiculous saying. However, it is true, though, that during and after the Carolingian era, political alliance was often tied to religious conversion. So what would happen is the kings of the Franks would offer peace and friendship with neighboring pagan tribes in exchange for conversion to Christianity. They'd say, look, we're very powerful. We can be your allies. We can help you. We can protect you. We can share our civilization if you convert to Christianity. So there was political incentive, political leverage that was wielded at times, especially during the Carolingian era. So Christianity was certainly not spread by the sword, but at times it could be wedded to political leverage in a way that Catholics today might be uncomfortable with, it. But that was just the way of things back then, because the success of the church and the success of the kingdom were often identical. If the church prospered, the kingdom prospered. All right, we're running up against time here, so let's do our synopsis. The things that made the Dark Ages dark were not a result of the church, but of the social, political, and demographic changes that came with the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, the church was primarily interested in extending the Christian religion. That was its main focus, but it also made many material contributions to life during the period, including education, scientific inquiry, land improvement, and other social and moral matters. While the church's activity during the time was not flawless by modern standards, it seems obvious that its influence was overall beneficial. I mean, the church had an overall beneficial kind of culture building impact on the era. Had the church not been around, the Dark Ages they likely would have been much more dark than they already were, had the church not been there to bring that mitigating influence to kind of perpetuate that light in all the ways that it did. All right, that is it. I'm going to take a drink of my water because I've been talking for 59 minutes straight. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'll take them momentarily here.
Yes, thank you so much, Philip. I'm going to go ahead and take back the screen. That was really so very informative and helpful for some of us who might not remember a whole lot of their history on the Dark Ages when we were in school. A really good way to help us understand what was myth, misunderstandings of that period, and how the church influenced it. Maybe not perfectly, but also certainly a lot of positive contributions. So thank you so much for that. And as you all can see, this book that Philip wrote, The Church in the Dark Ages, is one of this entire series on reclaiming Catholic history. So addressing many of those myths or misconceptions. And
And there's
not
a lot more of them in the book than we talked about in this
I'm
webinar.
sure, yeah.
Yep.
And not directed to the person that has a history degree only, but to the average person, the average Catholic. So thank you so much for all of that. I invite you all to look further into this series, this book, using the code webinar 1207 for a 25% discount if purchasing at Ave Maria Press, and that goes for a little bit over a week. So we invite you to take a look at those. Philip, again, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you for everyone who has shared this time with us. It was definitely helpful. And if you are interested in receiving emails for future webinars, you can go to this website here, avemariapress.com/webinars, and sign up to receive the weekly emails. So thank you, everybody, again. Thank you, Philip. Have a great day, a holy Advent, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.